Hello and welcome to the Connect Group Bible Study. We're so excited to have you with us today. Now, Dan has just preached up a storm
Hi
on
there.
Sunday. Here's Dan.
A storm. Oh, great.
Yeah, I think that was positive. It was
Okay,
good. I
great.
liked it. Anyway, it was on
Thanks.
John chapter 21, verses 7 to 17. So we'd like to start today by you guys reading through that again. If you've got that in front of you, then put a question mark over any questions you have over the passage, an exclamation mark over anything that stands out to you, and an arrow for anything that the passage is telling you to do. Okay, so take a moment and read that together now.
Great. So I hope you enjoyed that. So last week we looked at the same chapter, but verses 1 to 7. And really sort of a quick summary of that is that Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection, and they're totally not expecting it. They've gone back to what they're knowing. They're back to fishing, and they've caught nothing. Jesus turns up on the shore. They don't realize it's him. And he says, cast your nets on the other side, and they catch more fish than they can carry. At which point the penny drops, and we see the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's John. That's the way he refers to himself in this book. And he said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Peter may not be the sharpest tool in the drawer, but he's the first in the water. He's passionate. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say it's the Lord, he wraps his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumps into the water. That's strange. We're going to come back to that. And they then encounter Jesus. And the thing that, as I looked at this passage, really what I saw is that Jesus, he shakes them. He intentionally confronts them. At the beginning of John's Gospel, it says that Jesus came with grace and truth. And having come with lots of grace at the beginning of the chapter, he still comes with grace, but he now follows up with truth. And really, as I was looking at this, I was trying to find some words around it. And then I saw this by a poet, Catherine McKennitt. She says this: "Now, every time I witness a strong person, I want to know, what dark did you conquer in your story? For mountains do not rise without earthquakes." Mountains do not rise without earthquakes. I can recreate that for you here by shaking and bringing the mountain up like that. Isn't that? It's like no expense spared there. But really that idea just kept coming back to me. And really I'd say that's what Jesus is trying to do to Peter here. He's shaking him to make Peter great, because Peter is a great leader. As we look back at history, he's one of the most influential people in the history of the world. But he didn't start like that, and often in his life he doesn't look like that. But Jesus shakes him to make him strong.
Is that what's happened to your voice? Have you been shaken?
Yeah, I've shaken. It's a little bit gravelly today. Okay, but there are 3 earthquakes that we see. First of all, Peter is confronted with his weakness. So they go out and they can't fish, and then they're told to throw their nets on the other side, and they get more fish than they can ever carry. And what Jesus is doing there is confronting them with their weakness, because this is their job. And they're not able to do it without Jesus' help. Like, we might be professionals, but we can't do what what we're supposed to be doing without Jesus' help. And he really rams that home for them. So it says, the other disciples followed in the boat, and when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Like, Jesus doesn't even need what they're not able to provide. Okay, that's the first thing. And then Jesus says to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught, which has to be one of the most sarcastic lines in Scripture, for never at any point in any gospel do any disciples catch any fish without the help of Jesus. Okay? And really what he's doing here is he's saying to them, look, you need me. Not to shame them, but to cause them to realize that we're dependent on him. Well, we are really dependent on Jesus for everything. And one of the ways we're most dependent on Jesus is that one of the things that we are most weak in is dreaming big for our lives. That often we'll sell ourselves short. The disciples, that key line, Peter says, I'm going out to fish. They've been called to be fishers of men, and they go back to fishing fish. They go back to what they know, what Jesus has called them out of. And so often that's what we do. We have small vision for our lives. And then when we win, the triumph itself makes us small, because we've only been competing in small things. And so really, like this first earthquake is he confronts Peter with his weakness, his shortcomings, and he does it.
Not a literal earthquake.
Not a literal earthquake here, but there is one later on. And really, Jesus does this to cause him to be dependent on him. It's really as we encounter these earthquakes that we change the most. Psychologists, they have a phrase for this. It's I'm not going to be able to remember it, but there's a fascinating little graph here. It's post-traumatic growth. That's what it's called in psychological terms. But this is a fascinating little graph. You can Google this. But this is, say, after a bereavement, after a death of a close one, there are all these there's 4 different ways we can react. And actually we go through this sort of script, if you like, which ends up causing us to grow and before we can go back to being a well-adjusted kind of person. And it's fascinating that we all face this kind of stuff in our lives. We all face earthquake moments, and a lot of that is just because we live in a fallen world. But here Jesus is intentionally doing it. He's intentionally making Peter face his weaknesses. And so the first little question that I'd love us to think about is actually a little exercise that you've got for us.
We want you to draw a timeline of your life. On above the line, so basically if you're born in 1986 like me and Dan, then you'd start there and then you'd enter the present, 2019.
And at which point you're either thinking, gosh, you're young, or you're thinking, gosh, you guys are so old. Yeah, okay.
That's probably what most people are thinking. Anyway, so you've got a timeline of your life, and on the above the line, we want you to put the good events of your life, those kind of peak moments. And then below the line, we want you to put the challenging ones. And we want you to reflect on which events have caused you to grow and how.
So here's an example from me, 1986. So we said making key friends at school was a positive. Going to school and getting a bad report that really shook me. Didn't get a place at uni straight away. That was a really key moment for me. But got married. That was a good moment for me.
That's that side of the line.
Babies are above the line, but immediately followed by not sleeping for quite a while. Draw a timeline of your life. Just take a moment by yourselves, and then just reflect and share in as much as you're comfortable to about which of those events cause you to grow and how. Okay, so that's the first earthquake, is that he confronts Peter with his weakness. The second earthquake is that he confronts Peter with his failure. So they get off the boat and they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And the fascinating thing is that Jesus has engineered everything in this scene, and every sight, smell and sound is in this scene to remind Peter of his sin. There's the bread from the dinner that they had before the cross, where Peter boasted, even if all others falter, not me, the pride before the fall. There's the fire like the fire that Peter warmed himself by as he denied his boast 3 times. And then it's morning. This whole scene is set at morning. There's the sunrise, and therefore there will be a cock crowing, the sound marking the moment after Peter betrayed his friend. And incidentally, that's a sound that he wakes up to every morning. Every morning he's woken up reminded, knowing what kind of person he is. And Jesus engineers this scene to remind Peter of his failure and his sin. Although, this is the amazing thing, he doesn't do it to bring him shame, but he does it so that Peter will know that the place of invitation is not perfection. The place of invitation is not performance, good performance. The place of invitation is not where you should be, but it's where you are, because it's in that place that Jesus comes and says, come and have breakfast. Come and have breakfast. He meets us in our worst place and says, come and be with me. Now, the amazing thing is as well that in the very same breath, he then reminds him of forgiveness. That same meal, Jesus broke bread and he gave it to them. So in that same breath, as it says here, he took the bread and he gave it to them. So he reminds Peter of his sin, but in the very next breath, he's reminding him of the promise of forgiveness. Now, the challenge is whenever we're reminded of our sin, often what we try and do is we hide. I think this is what is going on here with Peter. Here we are. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he'd taken it off, and jumped into the water. This is a silly thing to do. There is nothing, it is not more efficient to swim wearing all of your clothes than just to stay in the boat, which is why the disciples followed in the boat. But Peter is doing what we're all tempted to do. When Jesus comes close to us and when he talks to us about our sin, our immediate temptation is to cover up, to put our best garments on, to put our best foot forward, to do what Adam did in the garden, which is to put a fig leaf on. And then he gets out on the beach and he covers his body and discovers that Jesus knows every corner of his soul. There's another irony. There's one painting here. I'll just share this. This painting is by an artist who's rendered Peter being reinstated naked. And it's a slightly strange painting. This is Liverpool Cathedral. And it's slightly to show that Jesus strips everything away from Peter. All the pretense is taken. Because actually, if he'd have put his clothes on to get into the water, to get dried, he'd have had to take them off afterwards. And whether or not this actually happened, literally, this happens metaphorically. Because Peter is stripped away of all of his boasts, everything that he could have put his trust in, and he just has to come to Jesus with
every way in which he could hide.
Yeah, every way in which he can hide. And Jesus, this is key, really. This is really key as us for our leadership, because if you don't get that Jesus knows you, then and still loves you, even though he knows you. Or often we only think we can be loved. We don't think we can be known. We think that if we are known, we won't be loved. But Jesus here shows Peter, you're known and you're loved. And this is key for our leadership, because if you don't know that you're known and know that you're loved, then you'll have to pretend. You'll lead out of your pretense and who you think you should be. But the moment you can be honest about who you are. See, the only way we know this story is because Peter talked about it afterwards. Because Peter knew, this is the only way we have any of these details and can read these words, is because Peter was honest about it. Do you know what? A leader who is honest about their limitations is easier to follow, because first of all, it's easier to have grace for them. It's easier to work out how to support them. But also, if you look invincible, people will wonder why it is that you don't do more for them. It's like, oh, you look invincible. You're Mr. Incredible. Why aren't you doing more for me? But if you're honest about your limitations, as Peter is, you become a much more effective leader. And so our second question really is this.
What experiences of failure or weakness have caused you to grow?
And to take it a level deeper, I think probably we've only got time to do this. And in a group setting, probably the top question is probably the best place to start. But maybe with close friends or just in your own prayer time, it'd be good to think, are there any failures that have happened in your life that you haven't yet gone back to look at? Because actually, if you go back to them, probably what you'll find is there's absolute gold there. Absolute gold to learn about yourself, but also learn about how you can lead differently and how God is calling you to understand who you are in Him. Grow. Yeah. So have a discussion of that first part of the question. What experience of failure or weakness have caused you to grow? And you might want to share a few. I know they might be funny, like when I tried learning violin for 10 years and got to grade 2, or they may be more significant. Share whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, so our last earthquake comes in the form of a question. Really, it's decision time. And Jesus comes to Peter with a question. He says, do you love me? And the first way he says it is, do you love me more than these? And that's slightly ambiguous. It could be, do you love me more than all these fish? Success. Do you love me more than success? There's a huge pile of fish, 153, and he's saying to Peter, do you love me more than success? Another way to understand is, do you love me more than the other disciples? Because that's what Peter had said before. I love you more. If all the others run away, not me. And but here he just says, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Already, there's no bold claims this time. It's just, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Again, Jesus says, Simon Peter, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time. These earthquakes hurt. Sometimes Jesus will shake us and it can feel like a hurt, but Jesus pushes past Peter's perceived hurt to reveal his heart. because it says faithful are the wounds of a friend in Proverb, and that's what Jesus is doing here. And in this moment, gone is the bravado, and gone is the comparison with other people, and it's just left with, Lord, you know all things. It's not based on Peter, it's based on Jesus. You know all things. You know that I love you. Now, each time Peter says, I love you, Jesus reinstates his call to be a leader in his church, to be a shepherd. He says, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. And then he says, feed my sheep. Each time, do you know what? The only qualification for ministry and leadership is, do you love me? Do you love me? This is a movement that is going to turn the world upside down. And all Jesus cares about is, do you love me? Because do you know what? If you love him, then you'll choose to be with him, and then you'll follow him, and then you'll receive everything you need because we're dependent on him. And so we will find we have all we need to lead and to love well. That's why the starting point is always, do you love me? And it's always the middle point and the end point as well. Now, this feels like an earthquake to us because we would rather talk about other things, if we're honest, most of the time. But this question cuts to the core. It's just, do you want to be with me? Do you just want to come and be my friend? And it cuts to the core because often we want to focus on competency. I love this, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which says that we are most confident when we are least experienced. That's Peter. If all others forsake you, not me. And Jesus intentionally lets him go all the way down to the bottom. And then in that bottom place just says, do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter has failures in the future. But the amazing thing is, what was a trigger of shame, cock-a-doodle-doo in the morning, now gets a reminder of, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Because Peter had other failures in his life. That's why this question is so important. The other reason it's so important is because it can feel slightly one-sided. I made a joke that, that it can be quite bad if you said to somebody that you loved them and maybe they didn't say it back. Like, could you imagine what that's like, Kate?
No, I couldn't.
No, you can't, but I can, because when I first told Kate that I loved her, she didn't say it back for 1 month, okay? That's not what Jesus is doing here.
He doesn't leave you hanging.
He doesn't leave you hanging, like my wife did. And he's gone all in. His love took him to the cross. Jesus became weak, he became human, and he died. He became, he embraced failure. He raised a team and they all ran away. But also, he loved. His love took him to the cross. And on the cross he died. And as he died, there was a literal earthquake as the center of the core being of the creator of the universe was torn apart as Jesus actually died. God, my God, why have you forsaken me? But Jesus did not remain dead, and he rose again. And as we look at Jesus, we can know that mountains rise through earthquakes because he was shaken more than all of us will be shaken. And yet he stands taller than anybody else in all of history. And what that means is that this is the most vulnerable thing. Jesus, having gone all in, comes to us and says, do you love me? Do you love me? You can't get much more vulnerable than that. I hate to quote, what is it? Love, not Love Actually, the other one. The other Hugh Grant film.
Oh yeah, Notting Hill.
Notting Hill. I'm just a girl standing before a boy asking. Like that's kind of the vulnerability, sort of, that Jesus stands before us, having gone all in. There's no questions on his part. And he just says, do you love me? And that's the question we have to keep coming back to as disciples of Jesus.
So that is the third question for us today. Do you love me? That's the only qualification to follow Jesus and serve him. So what we'd like you to do is to share in the group what it is you love about Jesus.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, share what you love about Jesus and then pray for each other to be filled with the Holy Spirit, as we always do. Have a great discussion, have a great sharing, and have a great week. God bless.